Hmm? Ah! Oh. And do you get a better line than Bill Paxton? That's it, man.
There's nobody that delivers lines
over,
better
man.
than Bill Paxton in that movie.
Game over. That's it, man. Oh my God. What are we gonna do now?
Hey, why don't we get around the fire? Why don't we roast some marshmallows, sing some songs? How about that?
Podcast Junkies, episode 66. In case you missed it last week, I spoke to Leah Tao. So if you haven't heard that one yet, I highly recommend that you check that out. I did something a little bit different. I recorded some audio of myself as I was getting ready for the interview, and captured a bit of the anxiety or nervousness as I was getting ready to head over to Leah's house. I was graciously invited over to conduct the interview, and she was amazing and gave me actually some tips on how to monitor the interview better. So you can hear that, episode 65. And it's always just a way for me to try something different. And like I said, that in person was the first time I did that. So this week we're back with Rem and Jonathan of the Sci-Fi Movie Podcast. And if that podcast rings a bell for regular listeners, it's because we are in the same podcast collective called Podcastica. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end of the interview, but I wanted I'd run into Rem in a chat room online probably last year, so I knew of him, and I was happy to see that we were in the same group once I joined. And I want to start to get to know the fellow members of my network a bit more. So it's going to be in the queue so some of the other folks that are on there. We're going to get them scheduled, and so you can learn a little bit more about who we are and what we do. And so I've always been a fan of science fiction movies since I was a little kid, and it's fascinating to hear two folks, and they alternate hosts, and at times there's been up to 4 people who have had hosting duties on the show. But today was just Rem and Jonathan, and I'm always fascinated when they can just take a topic and dissect it and talk ad nauseum about the ins and outs, the intricacies, the logic, the science behind some of these shows, where initially we just watch them and we think, wow, it's cool special effects or great, alien or action sequence. And, some of these movies I really identified with in terms of my childhood, and they just left a lasting impression. I think about movies like Terminator and Aliens, and obviously 2001 Space Odyssey. So it was interesting to talk to people who live and breathe this, and they have a show every week. And they don't just tackle the blockbusters, they tackle some of the duds too, and why they didn't work. So it's a fascinating podcast. If you haven't had the chance to listen to it, I highly recommend the Sci-Fi Movie Podcast. And without further ado, my discussion or conversation with Rem and Jonathan.
Have you done interviews with 2 people yet? Because all I've heard so far.
I have not.
Really?
So this should be interesting.
Yeah,
so you guys you might have to fight over who gets to answer the question.
It's going to be Rem.
Well, I don't want to fight. I'll just shut up and let Jonathan do all the talking, because that's the way he is.
Rem kind of beats me into submission like every week. You don't hear it in the show.
Not supposed to say those things. You're not supposed to.
This is where we find out if there's a pecking order.
Every week there's a tragedy that happens. It doesn't make it into the show.
And it's usually me doing the extra.
Is Rem like the
That's true.
Is Rem like the Joker in Dark Knight, where he everyone, they only tell the first person in front of them that there's like, oh, it's just you and this guy, and then he keeps shooting the guy, and then at the end it's just him. He's like,
yeah. Jonathan didn't know that we used to have 4 co-hosts at one point. Did you, Jonathan?
I did not. No. Rem just brought me on board and started calling me the new guy, and I was just lucky to be there.
Well, I can't think of a better way to start the show then. So, Jonathan and Rem, thank you so much for being guests on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you, Harry. Thanks for inviting us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
And I'm glad we're now members of the same network, so we're keeping it all in the family.
Yeah. At some point, we're going to have to find a way that we can all get together for drinks, which
Yes.
would be great.
We
I would
keep
love
trying.
that.
Well, podcast movement, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Jonathan, when you talked about the idea, or you and Remi talked about it, and I think I have to figure out what's the order here, and you guys can let me know, because when you look on the site, there's a couple of other folks who are not on, Ian and Tim. So I'm wondering, I'll hear it from John, and then maybe Remi can fill in. But what's the founder story for Sci-Fi Podcast?
The founder story?
Yeah.
Well, actually, Rem and Ian started it together. They did about 4 episodes before I came into the scene. And of course, these are 4 movies that I would have loved to have done. Rem.
I hear you. I hear you all the time.
Sounds like it's a point of contention there.
Not really. I don't have any contentious thoughts of it. I just harbor negative feelings towards Rem a little bit every day.
It's just a little bit. But I space it out over a period of time. It's not a lot of negativity at once. It's measured. It's measured.
It's just enough to make Rem worry, just enough to keep him bald.
So, because I knew that it had been started with Rem, and I'm wondering, I don't know if you would consider yourself an outsider, Jonathan, but had you been listening to the podcast up in that point? Like you said, it was only 4 episodes, but I'm wondering what your take on it was coming in.
I had never heard a podcast, and I wasn't at all in the podcasting world, and I didn't even actually listen to their podcast before joining in.
What?
Yeah, I didn't listen to the podcast before joining in. I knew because you had told me, Rem, what the structure was, right? And then we had the idea of the first episode that I would be there being the Disasteroid episode.
Yeah.
Where it was Armageddon versus Deep Impact. So I just kind of did way too much research into those 2 movies, and I just came expecting to talk about it, and that's exactly what happened. And we just kind of blabbed on for a while, and we kind of had no real structure, I think, for the first. I would say, how long would you say, Rem? Like 20, 25 episodes, 30 episodes?
Yeah, we would go fairly open as far as format goes. We had a basic loose structure that we followed, but we didn't have a time frame in place. And it wasn't until we got to maybe 34, 50 episodes in that I said, okay, we need to give this podcast a time frame. Because at one point we had recorded for 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Well, that was for
The Matrix.
The Matrix and Star Wars. Actually, our Star Wars episode, we recorded for longer than the movie was.
Yeah.
So Rem had this idea to kind of condense it down to an hour or thereabouts. And initially, I didn't think that was a good idea. But being the guy that I am, I'll try anything once. So we tried it, we did it, and I found that doing that made me bring my only the best little nuggets that I had to bring instead of just smashing out everything. So I just bring the best, and it's really, I think, helped the show. And you listen to the show now, and the flow sounds really good, and everything's very tight like a tiger.
Was that your Australian accent?
That was as close as I can get to. Actually, that was trying to be Dutch from what was that Gold member? Toy like a tiger.
So Rem, when you first started it, did you have an idea what the structure would be? Because as Jonathan alluded to, some of the episodes went really, really long. But did you have a podcast in mind that you were modeling off of, or one that you listened to when you first started?
One of the first guys that I kind of modeled is a guy named Robin Pearson, who has a site called The TV Critic. And I loved how he would dig into things like Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead, and he would talk about things that worked really well in an episode, things that didn't work, and he'd also talk about unknown things. So I kind of ripped off from him that idea of what works, what doesn't work. And initially, I wanted the podcast to be 15 minutes. I wanted to get in, talk about a movie. This is Alien. This is what was really good about it. This is the things that didn't work about it. In, out, gone. And I wanted it to be a podcast that somebody could listen to on a 15-minute coffee break, because I would get frequent 15-minute coffee breaks. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a podcast you could listen to, enjoy, and then get back to work? And when Ian and I first did Alien, I think that ran about a half an hour. And I thought, okay, well, maybe the nature of the conversation we're having requires us to go to a half-hour format. Then we noticed we brought in Jonathan, and since he just goes on and on and on about stuff, we thought, well, we might have to make the podcast longer. Is he still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, right.
See, I'm not even going to argue that because it's so true.
It's so true.
It's so true. Rem does all the editing, and thank God for Rem because he makes me sound way smarter than I actually am. He takes all my ums and ahs, which I've been working on, but they're still there. And he narrows the podcast down from, I just remember that 2-hour episode for The Matrix down to, what was it in the end? Like an hour 20, an hour 10 or something like that?
Yeah, I cut a lot of stuff out.
Yeah.
And we noticed too that as we have more co-hosts, because sometimes we'll have a guest host on, it was typically the three of us. And sometimes we'd have a guest host on. So I realized that for every additional person we brought in, because they're going to be conveying their ideas and their opinions, the show has to be longer. So then the show started to get a lot longer, and then there was no sense of how long a listener could expect a show to be. And going back to the radio days, there needs to be that expectation that your listener can have as to a basic idea of what to expect. And then when I would edit these shows, editing a 2-hour podcast,
not fun.
Brutal. So it was partly as a way to save my own sanity. So I went to the guys and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to 1 hour. I made up a basic radio clock, 15 minutes here, 10 minutes for this section, 20 minutes for this, 5 minutes to the top of the hour, and we're out. And you wouldn't really hear that if you listen to the episode, but it's a basic structure that we follow. So now that the show's around 55 minutes to an hour, I can usually get that edited. A complete editing job from start to finish takes about 4 hours.
So, Jonathan, you said for the first ones where you came on, you did a lot of research. I guess because maybe you thought there was going to be like a deep dive, and I guess you didn't want to get booted off the first.
that was one thing. And I wanted to sound smart, or at least seem smart. And I still do a lot of research for every movie that we do every week. But now I don't bring everything. I just bring the best nuggets because I find all kinds of crap.
And it must be a rabbit hole sometimes, because you get into some of these sites and they just start getting into this arcane knowledge about the director and what the hidden meaning was, and then you end up having to watch the movie 2 or 3 times. And I imagine this could become a project for you that could take longer, like you said, than the actual movie itself.
And that sometimes happens. I watch the movie at least once before we talk about it, preferably the day before or 2 days before. But if it's a really complex, in-depth movie that there's a lot to, which we've had quite a few of them, then sometimes that warrants a second viewing and digging in deeper into the research to find more about it. That doesn't always come to light. That doesn't not all of my research has bubbled to the surface so that we display in the show, and I'm okay with that. That's perfectly fine. That's kind of expected. You're not going to get everything out in every show. But yeah, I do a ton of research, and sometimes it takes me down quite the rabbit hole.
So, Rem, talk about the selection, because it seems that you purposely, on occasion, pick movies that are considered, for all intents and purposes, pretty bad, and that going into it, obviously, because you've seen it before. But do you make a conscious effort to just go back and forth between blockbusters and duds?
Like the Christmas special, the Star Wars Christmas special? Is this one of the... Yeah,
that comes to mind.
Universally considered some of the worst television ever committed to celluloid. Well, when we're looking at movies, what I'll first do is I'll go through and I'll compile a list of movies that I recognize and think might be appropriate for the movie, might be appropriate for the podcast. And I like going and finding movies that maybe the guys haven't heard of. We did one... from I think it was 1972 called Silent Running. And it's one of those films that if you're kind of my age, you probably recognize it, but it's a film that had a robot that went on to inspire the design of R2-D2 in Star Wars. So some of these older films and some of these more obscure films kind of pave the way for the films that come. And every once in a while, we'll find something that's a real nugget, a real gem, and we'll try to find how this film has affected other films, because there certainly is a lineage. You can see everything going up to Star Wars and then everything after Star Wars. There's almost like a pre and post tendency there with films. So when I'm looking at films, I look at things that I'll recognize. We get suggestions from some of our listeners. We had a fellow who wrote in today, said, you got to do this film called Gabriel, which came out in 2007, and it's an Australian film. I don't know it, so I'm going to go dig it up and have a look. So we get suggestions from the people who listen to the show, and then we look at things like, is it a popular movie? Sometimes we'll do it, and then we'll look at other films that are going to be coming out later in the year. So we're starting to put together the list for 2016 and getting a sense of what movies are coming out next year. And then we'll maybe take some movies that are similar to that, or maybe films that were prequels or sequels to that, and then slot those in. And then going through IMDb. IMDb is a really good resource for us. So we'll look for these films, and with science fiction, there's so much stuff, and sometimes it'll boil down to taking a dozen movies and then asking our listeners what they think. And we're just about to do that, where I put it out on Facebook. On Facebook, we put a list out of maybe 75, 100 movies and said, hey, which movies should we talk about? And we get responses from people, and that kind of guides us how we pick our movies.
What's the earliest recollection of watching a sci-fi movie in the theater that you have?
Star Wars? Still Star Wars. Star Wars was the first. I think it was the first one. The one that had the most impact was Alien. And I saw it when it came out in the theater, and my brother and sister snuck me in because I was too young to see it. They got me in the door somehow. And yeah, it was one of those films that I remember trying to sleep that night, but being so afraid that there was something under the bed that was going to come and burst out of my chest. Yeah. Yeah. So I think it was really Star Wars and Alien. Those were the two that made the biggest impression. Then growing up in the States, we used to have this channel in the Bay Area. Used to live in a place, you may know of it. It's not too far from Oakland and the Hayward area, and it's called Castro Valley.
Okay.
So I was born there, and they used to play this show on the weekends called Creature Features, and it was a weekly show hosted by this guy named Bob Wilkins. And he was sitting in this chair in this creepy old house with, the skull candles, and he'd have a big pipe, and he would be sort of the host of the movie. And they would play some of the scariest movies for a person my age.
Yeah.
Terrifying, but fascinating at the same time. So that kind of got me into those sort of like 50s movies, Earth versus the Flying Saucer, 20 Million Miles to Earth. Started to get the education very young.
Jonathan, what's your earliest recollection of sci-fi?
For me, it was seeing Star Trek 4 in the theater back in 1986.
Is that the one with the whales?
You go straight to hell. I can't stand it when people go, this is the one with the whales.
So Harry, whenever a Star Trek fan mentions that film, just say, is that the one with the whales? And watch them explode on you.
The movie has a name. It's The Voyage Home. Anyway, I was 6 years old when that came out, and that's kind of the first recollection of seeing sci-fi in the theater. I'd seen Star Trek 2 and 3, of course, before that, but that was all home video stuff. But for a big theater experience for sci-fi, that was my first.
So so Jonathan, you think there's something about the imprint it leaves on you when you're at such a young age? I actually remember seeing Jaws at a drive-in theater. My parents took me. It's crazy, but I think it has something to do with the age you were at the time, and if that's your first experience, that sort of lives with you forever, right?
Absolutely. And a nostalgia factor is one of the things that we think about when we talk about movies on the podcast, because there are movies that are good and you could look back and they're critically good. Then there's movies you can look back and you can see that the movies are really, really bad, but you still love them because you were raised with them. Like you grew up with this stuff. And that's the way it is. That's just the way it is. So nostalgia, I think, plays a huge factor in seeing anything at a young age is if you like it initially, you're probably going to be hooked for life.
And were you a fan of the TV show as well?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
What did you think, Harry, when you saw Jaws? You were how old when you saw it at the drive-in?
Oh, geez, I'm gonna date myself here.
Did you find it
less under 10, I guess. What year did it come out?
78,
8?
something like 78?
Yeah. So I was
Jaws, the first Jaws,
yeah.
75.
Oh no, then well, maybe I saw it in a drive. No, I don't think it was 5.
Jaws 2 was 78.
Oh, maybe it was Jaws 2 then. Yeah, I think it was 7 or 8.
So did you avoid the water? Were you ever afraid of a shark? Because that's a much more realistic possibility than an alien in space.
Yeah.
You know what, Rem? I don't think you need to see Jaws to be afraid of sharks. I think it's just okay to be afraid of sharks.
Yeah, just
They're terrifying alpha predators of the sea.
as a general practice.
As a general practice, be afraid of sharks.
So you would say, Harry, that you practice shark avoidance on a daily basis?
I don't. Yeah. I mean, I'm actually not a fan of the beach, but I don't think it's because of the sharks. I don't think I think about it too much. But I'm like, I imagine if I was surfing or I like to swim deep in the ocean, maybe I'd think about it. But I don't go in with enough frequency to have it be something that's top of mind. Now, predator, that scares me.
Because you're frequently in jungle scenarios?
Yes. And no matter how much mud I put on to mask my heat signature, it just doesn't seem to work.
I know what you mean. You know, you can only pack on so much mud before it just starts to get dry and it gets all cakey and it plays havoc with your complexion and then it gets all over your eyelashes.
Yeah.
You know, if you're being hunted in the jungle by a predator while you're covered in mud, I don't think your complexion is going to be top of your worry list.
So Predator, is that sci-fi?
I would absolutely say so. What do you think, Jonathan?
Yes, for sure. Absolutely, yeah. It's got weird aliens in it.
Yeah.
I'll mark that down as sci-fi.
So is that so? I take it that hasn't been covered.
Oh boy, has it ever? Yeah, we actually talked about Predator and of course Predator 2 with Danny Glover.
And
a classic, an absolute classic.
And who's the other guy who's on Walking Dead now? Fear the Walking Dead.
Oh, which
the Puerto Rican guy.
Oh, Ruben Blades.
Ruben Blades, he was in it.
Ruben Blades is great.
Yeah,
he's actually the best part of Fear the Walking Dead.
Yeah, he's a good actor.
Yeah.
So Rem, what's the line between horror and sci-fi? Because Alien sort of crossed that, straddled both sides, right?
Yeah, it really does. When you look at Alien, I think the sci-fi component is being a futuristic story where the mining of space has become the norm. So here's a film that's set in the future, and space travel is no longer this frontier that we're trying to conquer. Now it's a resource base. So when you look at a ship like the Nostromo, a commercial towing vehicle, which is hauling a refinery back to Earth, working in space is no big deal. And one of the reasons I like this movie so much is that they treated it with such realism. It's a dark, dirty, oily, greasy ship. It doesn't have that, pretty, plasticky, shiny interior that we see in a lot of the more sanitized sci-fi. So I think that's where we get the sci-fi quality. And then when you take the Alien, created by Giger, that people unfamiliar with his artwork wouldn't have expected something like that. If you know Giger's work, you see that kind of biomechanical quality is present in a lot of his artwork. But to see them create the villain or the monster using Giger's vision, that brought the horror. And man, did that make an impression.
So
I think for me, when I talk about kind of a fantasy versus sci-fi, because I see horror is kind of a really broad topic that a lot of other genres can fall under. You can have a horror sci-fi, you can have a horror western, you can have a horror kind of supernatural thing. And the big difference for me is, where is the movie going to ask me to suspend my disbelief? If it's going to ask me to suspend my disbelief because of a fantastical or magical reason, then I'm not going to consider that sci-fi. If it's going to ask me to suspend disbelief for a science-based reason, for example, we have ships in outer space that can fly faster than light, then that delves into the realm of science fiction.
So, Jonathan, do you think Alien is science fiction as well as horror?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Science fiction and horror. And the two can go hand in hand.
So then Aliens, which for me is, one of the best movies of all time. And I think maybe because of the timing of when I saw it, but I think it got that perfect mix of like action, big budget blockbuster, a little bit of comedy thrown in, special effects, and just the pacing of the film is, and from just every time I remember watching it, it seems just like just one nonstop roller coaster ride.
Yeah, Alien and Aliens are two very different beasts. And a lot of people don't realize when they watch Aliens, if they're expecting that from Alien, they're not going to get it. Alien is a slow-paced, building up horror movie, whereas Alien is a much more fast-paced action movie. It's very. When did it come out? The 80s?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very much a sci-fi action movie versus a horror movie.
And the unofficial sell line for it was, this time it's war. Because James Cameron was thinking, well, how do you put Marines in space? Yeah. Space Marines. And I think it still stands up in my top 5 of all time, because it continues the Alien story beautifully. We see a character in Ripley who has survived this devastating event and then gets thrown into the grinder again, somehow manages to survive. And then when they introduce Newt as a character, and Newt becomes Ripley's almost surrogate daughter, and that relationship that forms between them, there's a real humanity that we see here. And I think this is where James Cameron really shines, because we have a female hero who's able to maintain her humanity. They took the cast. They actually put them through military training. So the cast, before they even started shooting, they were actually in boot camp together. So that rapport that you see on screen, they built that. That actually existed. And those are the kind of things that when you take the time to make a cohesive cast and give them the time to generate that chemistry, it really shows on screen. And that's where it really pays off.
And do you get a better line than Bill Paxton? That's it, man.
There's nobody that delivers lines better than Bill Paxton in that movie.
Game over.
That's it, man. Oh my God.
What are we gonna do now? Hey, why don't we get around the fire? Why don't we roast some marshmallows, sing some songs? How about that?
And then there's who was the actor who was on the TV show, and he was the guy who wanted to bring the alien back, harvested with inside Ripley.
Oh, Paul Reiser.
Paul Reiser, yeah. I mean, because up until that point, you had seen him in this like comedic roles, and he like takes a twist as this like evil, like
sinister
bastard,
company man.
Yeah, bastard corporate guy.
Corporate douchebag.
Yeah, he was just on an episode of Bill Maher, I think not this past week, but the week before that. He is looking his age now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the company man thing is taking its toll.
So I'm wondering, as you look at some of these and you think about the movies that end up standing the test of time, is a lot of it have to do with story or effects or a balance of both? I'm wondering, Rem, if you could talk about that, and then Jonathan chime in.
I think the storyline, it's going to be a combination of the story that's being told and the way the characters are able to build themselves into the story. A good example is Terminator. Very low budget film, one of the earlier ones from James Cameron. It's a film that I can still go back and watch today, even though it's got a bad music soundtrack. Was done on a synthesizer by somebody for next to no money.
Very 80s.
Very 80s. And I go on at length about using 80s music in movies, which I think is generally a bad idea.
Except for Toto.
Christ. I think Jonathan saw that one coming. So looking at how the film develops itself, it's really a human character driven story that has a science fiction wrapper around it. Mm-hmm. And I think it really boils down to the characters that you put in the situation. If you can have characters that are interesting and compelling and flawed, people that you can cheer for or cheer against, and tell a story that doesn't insult the listeners. I think that's the real secret. And I think we're seeing more and more of these films now. We're seeing really good quality stories like The Martian. It's a really well told story that's scientifically grounded. And I think when people get too absorbed in things like special effects, Michael Bay, then the characters get lost. And then you don't care about the characters, and then I can't care about what's happening. So for me, it's got to be strong, interesting character development and a plausible, interesting story that I can follow.
Jonathan?
Well, Rem, you really hit it on the head there. I think I don't know what I can say to follow that. God, this is why I hate following Rem on anything. Steals all my points. But I have to agree. Story is absolutely necessary. Characters that you care about, that you can empathize with, that you want to follow is so important. The story is also important. I'd say they're almost equal parts, because I could watch a really interesting character, but only for so long. And I can watch a really interesting story, but if I don't care about the characters, then you're going to start losing me. One of the great examples of this is the show, the movie Moon, starring Sam Rockwell, where it's just him and
Kevin Spacey as the robot.
As the robot.
Gertie.
As Gertie. And they basically have to kind of act together, and it's almost entirely character driven, but there's still a story there that makes me want to follow it. You know, if it was just about a guy stuck on the moon, I'm probably not going to care if he just goes cabin fever crazy. But there's a story behind it that I want to get into. Now, you counterpoint that with and let's say any Michael Bay movie.
Good.
Where it's all about the visual effects. He spends so much time creating these big set pieces with these big special effects and too many explosions, and the characters are lost, and the story is a little, well, I don't say a little weak, probably very weak. And you just, like, there's a point where you go, I just can't watch any more Michael Bay movies. And for me, it was supposed to be the third Transformers movie, but when I saw the advertisements for the fourth one, and certain actors can draw me in, and Kelsey Grammer's an actor who I look at and I go, oh, well, if Kelsey Grammer's in it, maybe I'll see it, maybe. And then Stanley Tucci was in it, and I'm like, okay, well, Kelsey Grammer and Stanley Tucci, I'm going to have to go see it. And then I went to go see it, and I'm like, why did I see this? Their characters were great, but they didn't have a good story behind it, and their characters weren't explained. I actually cared about Stanley Tucci's character, and he was the bad guy.
Wait, wasn't that the one with Donnie Wahlberg?
Yes, Marky Mark was front and center on that one.
Wasn't that enough to make you not go?
No.
Feel it.
No, I'm kind
feel
of
the vibration.
I'm kind of on the fence about Marky Mark, because there's stuff I really like him in.
I like him. Yeah, he was good in Departed.
And there's stuff that is just, he's in, it's just awful. Like
The Happening?
The Happening is immediately comes to mind. That movie was terrible, but like he's done good and bad work. Like, he did, what was the one where he was a hit? Oh, The Big Hit. Okay. I don't know if anybody's seen The Big Hit. It was ridiculously silly, but he was fun in it. And then he does things like Planet of the Apes, that remake, the Tim Burton one from, God, what, did the early 2000s? That was brutally bad. So, I mean, it's not enough for me to want to just not see a movie because he's in it, because it might be good. It might be. He was in Ted and Ted 2, and those are two of my favorite, almost my favorite comedies of all time. They're just so funny.
I think, too, you'll find a point where you can look at an actor like Charlize Theron. Love Charlize Theron. But I saw Mad Max Fury Road, and it wasn't, to me, a good enough film to make me want to go see it just for her. There's got to be more to it than that. And we take a film like Robot and Frank, which Jonathan introduced to me a few months ago. And it's a sweet little story with Frank Langella. and this robot. And it's a little sleeper movie that few people have seen. And I've kind of made it a mission now to introduce this to people as much as I can. Because when you look at the elements of sci-fi and storytelling, I will take Robot and Frank over all of the Transformer films combined.
Oh, yeah. What about The Last Mimsy? Did you guys see that?
The Last Mimsy? What?
That
Did you make that up?
Familiar. No, we didn't. I've heard of this.
It's something to do with some sort of box that comes to Earth, and these kids. It's along the lines of like a Jumanji.
Okay.
But it's it has some pretty. There's some pieces of it that I thought were interesting when they tell stories that I'm a big fan of, like stories that delve into like other dimensions and like Interstellar and stuff like that. So when there's some movies that have a piece of that in there, and like I sort of gravitate to some of those movies, and I'm fascinated by stuff like that.
Did you enjoy Interstellar?
I loved it. Absolutely loved it.
Oh, interesting. We have to do it on the podcast still, so maybe we'll get you on to talk about it with us.
Well, I mean, it's because I've been reading a lot about like multiple dimensions, and I think the story is extremely slow, and it takes like a long time to get to the punchline or wherever they're going with that, and some of the dialogue is hard to hear. I mean, my wife is from Colombia, and she's like, "What the hell is what's his name saying?" Who's the
Matthew
old guy?
McConaughey?
No, him always. But I mean, who's the old guy who dies?
The old guy who dies.
Alfred and the new.
Yes.
Michael Caine.
Michael Caine.
Yeah, and he was mumbling a lot during that movie.
That's because that's how he acts. That's his thing.
So, I mean, there's a lot, when you think about it, but I put so much weight, and I think I skewed heavily on like the last 30 minutes of it, because for me, it's just the way that he outlined that was so in line from like my thoughts of how that could be portrayed, and the fact that he was able to show it on screen in a way that wasn't like completely ridiculous. I was like, whoa, okay.
There are people who really enjoyed it, people who really didn't, and I came out more on the side of enjoying it because I think you're probably a little bit more patient with movies. Yeah. You'll probably give it a chance to develop itself and do its thing, and sometimes a movie can be slow and still be good at the same time, and sometimes it takes that time to be able to really build the characterization.
Yeah, I'm a fan of movies that make you think. I remember when I went to go see Memento. I literally walked out of the theater, went to eat pizza. This was in New York City, and then I was with my brother and my two brothers, and then one of them I said, I'm gonna go back in and watch this again right now because I need to figure out like what just happened, and then with the context of having seen the whole thing through, and then I'll like go back in. I had some notes, and I'm like, okay, this is happening now because of that happening, and so I like movies that make my brain hurt every now and then. And then of course I'm guilty of watching The Expendables as well, so it's
wow.
But that was a guilty pleasure. That was like every kid or every person who watches all these action movies from the 90s, and they said, wow, I guess why wouldn't it be cool if Sylvester Stallone was in a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like that'll never happen, that their contracts will never allow that. But now that they're all old and washed up, it was just hilarious. Don't get me wrong, they're absolutely horrible movies, but it's one of those when the wife goes on a trip, I'm like, okay, I want to see what this is about. And it's like every single action movie star that you can think of is in there, and it's so funny. It's like when you used to think when you were a kid and used to play with like your G.I. Joe and like you have all your action figures, and you would mix up your Star Wars and your G.I. Joes, and like it didn't matter. You just like mashed them all together. And that's what I felt that series is. Yeah,
so you've got a little Predator and you got a little Hulk who's fighting a little Obi-Wan Kenobi, and they're all just multi-universe mashup.
Yeah.
I'm right there with you, though. I'm guilty of watching The Expendables, but I know that it's a guilty pleasure going into it. I know that this is going to be a terrible movie. I'm going to laugh at it for probably 90% of the time, but I'm really only there to see Dolph Lundgren kick some ass.
Yeah, I think that was part of the allure, I guess, with Predator versus Alien, right?
Yeah. So much potential. So much potential. And I think when we looked at, my favorite character being the alien and then having the introduction of the Predator, what I really dug about these two characters is that they had backstories that we didn't really know. You know, even now, if you take Prometheus and put that aside, until Prometheus came out, we didn't know where the alien comes from.
Yeah.
And we still don't have much information about the Predator homeworld. And I love the process of digging into those characters and finding out the origin stories. Like tell me more about the Predator. How does their society work? How does their social structure work? You know, they drop off young predators in these hostile environments, and if they survive, great. But it would be really great to dig more into those characters and find out how those societies work. And then the process of bringing them together, I like the idea. I just wish it could have been better fleshed out.
I agree. Execution was faulty.
Because in this particular case, you know that in order to have aliens to fight, you need to have hosts.
Yeah.
So we need to put a certain amount of cast in here to be the hosts, and we can't really develop them too much because they've got chests have to explode. So they didn't develop the characters in a way that we got in, say, like an Aliens.
That's a good point. Jonathan, how much disbelief are you willing to suspend for the sake of a decent storyline?
I'm willing to suspend quite a bit as long as you don't ask me to disbelieve something I know to be a fact. And I'm going to give you the best example I can, was the first G.I. Joe movie. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I may have.
I thought you might have. Now, at the end of the movie, they have this big attack at this underground base that's underneath ice, and their big idea is that they're going to explode a big chunk of the ice above, and this whole ice shelf is going to crush the base below. And it works because in their universe, ice sinks. And that's like a breaking point for me. I'm like, okay, I know ice floats. You can't just write in and the ice sinks down and crushes them because it doesn't work. I'm willing to suspend a lot of disbelief, but you can't tell me that ice sinks.
That's funny.
So that's the breaking point.
That is just one of the breaking points. You can't take a fundamental thing that people know and say, poof, no, we're doing the opposite of that. Like, tell me this ship can go faster than light, no problem. Tell me you can turn people into energy, zap them to a different place, and reassemble them from energy back into matter. I'm even willing to believe that. But you tell me that ice sinks? No, I don't think so.
Well, the energy one is easy. I mean, when you start pulling out the microscopes and you start digging deeper and you start looking at the protons and the quarks and everything just starts vibrating. When you get down low enough, you're like, okay, so you just got to figure out a machine that makes us quarks, and then we'll all vibrate.
Yeah,
and
at some point, we're all energy anyway. It's just a matter of breaking it down and then being able to transform it and then reassemble it, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
But then again, there's the Heisenberg principle, which is why Star Trek has the Heisenberg compensator as part of their transporter system.
Okay, you can't introduce the Heisenberg principle for the listener without at least giving us the 30-second explanation.
Well, the Heisenberg principle basically states that you can do one of two things. You can observe the position or the movement of a particular atom, quark, or something like that, but never both at once. And to transport anything in the way that Star Trek does, you would have to know both those things.
So that begs the question, Jonathan, what was your favorite subject in grade school?
Math. I was really good at math, and I did honors math. I did acting too, and that was a lot of fun. I did a lot of improv, but the course I had the most fun with and the easiest time with was math. But
Why?
I'm a dork. I
mean, everyone's got their own subjects, but was it something that runs in your family, or are your parents?
No, if you knew my dad, you would know it definitely did not run in the family. I think the biggest thing is that I failed grade 9. I straight up was smoking a lot of pot. and doing a lot of skateboarding. And this is actually a year I was living with my dad. And he's not a what anybody would call a responsible parent. I love my dad, but he was a terrible father in terms of being a dad. And I've learned a lot about what not to do from him. But so I was doing a lot of pot. I wasn't going to school pretty much at all. I was getting into a bad way, so I ended up failing grade 9 entirely, and I redid grade 9, and that failure kind of snapped me back into well, shit, I guess I should probably learn and stuff. I ended up moving back to Vancouver and living with my mom, and I never failed a grade after that. And math was one of the things that, as I redid it, things snapped into place. And there was always a point in my learning where if I have a confusing thing, eventually it just kind of snaps and I get it. And math was one of those things that early on it snapped and I got it and I never stopped getting it.
And that's obviously painted your perspective on how, since we're talking about the movies, how you look at them through that lens, and how you apply that your logic to what you see on the screen. I
do. I'm incredibly analytical. There's things where I'll note, like, especially if it's, and I've mentioned these in certain podcasts before, how certain numbers appear in certain places and at certain times for certain reasons that the movie makers put in that a lot of people just don't get. And then there's inside jokes like Star Trek's use of the number 47. I don't know if you know about that.
No, I don't.
It's an inside joke that started back in the Next Generation era, where a couple writers would, whenever they needed a number, they would use 47 or its inverse, 74. And that's why you get a lot of, where are we going? Starbase 4747. What's this new species? The Borg are calling it 8472, right? How many survivors did we beam from the Lacool? I got 47 out of 250. So other writers started picking up on this, and they started putting it in more and more until the number 47 has become almost iconic amongst Trekkies who are the deep nerds. And that we recognize it as the most common number in Star Trek.
Interesting.
See, I didn't know that. That's really good information for me.
Yeah. So, Rem, can you explain for the non-sci-fi fans what exactly is the beef between Star Wars and Star Trek fans?
I think I'm going to have to defer to Jonathan on this one, because Jonathan is much more knowledgeable about the Star Trek universe than I am. I have always been more of a Star Wars guy.
But so coming from your perspective, I'm wondering what your take on it is.
I don't see a reason for a beef personally, because I think there's room for both. It's the same thing, it's the same sort of mentality that says you can enjoy one color, but you can't enjoy this other color. Well, I think you can kind of enjoy them both. I love Star Wars first, but I really came to enjoy Star Trek. So I think there's room for both. Jonathan, what do you think? Is there how did they split? How did the chasm happen between Star Wars and Star Trek?
Well, they both have the word star in their name.
Oh,
so instantly people are going to pit one against the other. It's like how you pit Aliens versus Predator. You're always going to pit those two against each other in your mind. It's always going to be Star Wars versus Star Trek. And I think, for me personally, Star Wars and Star Trek are apples and oranges. I can't compare the two. I love them both. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and I'm a bigger Star Trek fan. But there's at no point will I say that one is better than the other for any reason. I love Star Wars for a whole set of reasons. I love Star Trek for a whole set of reasons. And I think what it is that people just like to see people fight. And that's where any kind of divide comes from, is, people just like seeing people fight. We like to put things up against each other and see who and see who wins. I mean, we've even been guilty of doing that on the podcast where we have these SmackDown episodes where we say, okay, well, who's going to win a Borg cube versus the Death Star? And we talk about it, and we come to a not always consensus. But that's just playful banter. I know a lot of people take it super seriously, and I think that's where you go wrong. Is I think it's okay to have fun with it, but when you start taking it seriously and you start taking it personally, as some people do, then that's a bridge too far.
Yeah, just ask Tupac and Biggie, man.
Yeah.
Well, you think about it like chocolate sauce and caramel sauce. I love them both, and I'm not going to banish one for the other, and I'm not going to say one is better than the other. I'm just going to have them both.
Yeah,
it should also be noted that I think Rem is lactose intolerant, so he's just doing these straight shots. Like he's not putting it on ice cream or anything. He's just drinking the syrup.
This is not coffee I'm drinking right now. This is caramel sauce in a coffee cup. It's my shameful secret.
So, Rem, talk about your background in radio, and if it's something, and if the podcast is an extension of something that you've like, it's always been something a part of your life.
Oh, radio, the dark arts. Radio was, not to sound dramatic, but radio was one of my best friends growing up. When we grew up, I used to have a little transistor radio when transistor radios were a thing. And going to sleep, I would listen to my favorite radio show, which was KSFO Mystery Theater. And I would be laying in bed with my radio next to my ear. That, as cheesily romantic as that sounds, it was a really close companion for me. When we moved to Canada, to Northern Ontario.
Sorry, Rem, that just sounded really sad.
I know.
I kind of feel a little bit for you inside.
Wait, it gets worse.
My best friend was a radio.
My best friend. That does sound pretty bad, doesn't it? It wasn't my best friend, but it was something that I liked to listen to at night.
His buddy.
When we moved to Northern Ontario, my parents brought us to Northern Ontario, a place called Kirkland Lake. And we lived out in the sticks, literally out in the sticks, where we had one radio station, which eventually I went to work for. And at night, the station would play CBC programming and religious programming and nothing that I could listen to. So I took about 100 feet of copper wire, strung it all over the roof of my house, plugged it into the back of my record player.
Wow.
Because I had one. And having that antenna plugged in, it gave me a chance to pick up other stations. So I would listen to a station called WLS out of Chicago, which was a rock station. So listening to rock music at night, going to sleep, it became a real friend. And I got to really like the radio announcers. And at some point later on after high school, I had an opportunity to work at a little station called CJKL, which is still in operation in Kirkland Lake. Hello, if you're listening from CJKL. And
come on, you can do the call letters better than that. Come on.
I could. It used to be an AM station, but I think it's FM now. So it's something FM CJKL. Okay. And I started working there as an overnight guy, doing overnights in radio. And it was a lot of fun. It was one of those things where being a young person, being able to play music and then talk to people in a cool studio, it was everything that a young person could kind of want. And then being that I had friends, radio was my friend growing up, I actually started to become that friend to other people. Because when you work overnight in radio, you get a lot of phone calls.
Strange ones. You
get some really strange phone calls. So you have some really interesting conversations. You get to know some people and build up that sort of connection and rapport. And I got to where I felt like I had a real connection with the listeners. And there was that sense of me talking to one person. And it could be a guy driving a snowplow in Hearst, or it could be some woman who is just coming home from a late shift at the hospital, or some guy working at an all-night gas station. It was my chance to be with people who didn't have anyone else to be with. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So there was it's kind of an odd relationship, but there was kind of an intimacy about that. And I loved how there was that sort of feedback that goes back and forth where somebody calls up and asks for a song and you play a song for them. And it's one of those things where we're serving people, but building a relationship at the same time. So podcasting, when that came along, that gave the opportunity to have that interaction with people again. And now, instead of people listening to us on the radio in one geographical area, we've got people all over the world. You've got people listening all parts of Europe. I'm sure you've got South America. I'm sure you've got China. And that's one of the things about podcasting is it really opened up the possibility to be able to get to know people over a greater distance. And I think the thing about radio too is that now the structure of it has changed so much where a lot of it's automated. With the podcast, we're able to have a kind of a loose structure. We have a basic structure to what we do, but we're not adherent to things like, oh, we've got to roll spots at 10 after the hour, or we've got to do news at the top of the hour, or traffic on the ones. We have a lot of the benefits of being able to broadcast like radio people without the CRTC regulations and all of those rules that go with it.
And you can curse as much as you want.
I could, but we don't. And we don't because I guess being in radio for so long, I learned that if I'm going to say something, I have to be able to do it without profanity, and it just carried through. And Jonathan and I could swear as much as we want to, but I think what we've done now is we've kind of set a tone for the show. And if we started dropping F-bombs right, left, and center, how do you think that would go, Jonathan?
Fantastic for me. I was a sailor. So I don't think that cursing is necessary. I mean, like I said, I was a sailor. I was in the Navy for 12 years, so I do have quite the proficient use of the curse words. But there's a time for it, and there's a time not for it. And there have been times occasionally on the show where I have let loose the occasional cuss word, and either Rem edits it out or we beep it. Or have you ever beeped it and just edit it out?
I usually just edit them out, but a few of them I've actually left in.
Yeah.
You should have the phaser sound, and you could just...
Hey, I like that.
That's a good idea. Rem, take a note.
I'm taking a note.
Phaser sound and more cursing, just so we can use it.
And set them on. Make sure you set them on stun.
Must set phasers to stun. Well, Jen over at the Congressional Dish, for her profanity, she drops in a golf swing.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
So she does that, and that's pretty cool. And I think if there was an instance where we really wanted to use profanity and it was appropriate, I can see the idea of maybe doing it. I think profanity is a wonderful thing. Contrary to what you'd think, I just think it has to be used appropriately. It's like putting icing on something. A little bit of icing is good. Yeah. Too much icing, after a while, the profanity tends to lose its punch.
Yeah, and like you said, you've got your audience of loyal fans, and if you did something out of the ordinary like that, it really, be a bit of a shock to them, I'm sure.
I know we've got people who listen while driving their kids to school.
Yeah.
So if we start doing that, that it's going to be something that people don't expect.
Yeah.
And we've been doing it without profanity long enough that I think we're okay.
How many years?
Who knows?
I think we're okay. And there was an episode a couple weeks ago where a lot of the comments had strong language in it, and we had to say beforehand, when we get to the comments section, this is going to have some strong language. So if you have kids around that you don't want to hear that language, then maybe they should leave the room.
Yeah, I think that's always a nice warning to parents. Yeah, always, I'm sure, listening with having their kids in the back seat or their kids in the house. So better safe than sorry on that.
Yeah, and there's an expectation. If we had the expectation that there's going to be profanity all the time, we'd be fine with it, and people would just know that either they want to listen to our show or they don't. But we've built up we've built up the expectation that we won't have it most of the time. So I think to change that right now would probably do us more harm than good.
So Jonathan, you gave me the opening for your Navy career there. You said 10 years, and it was due to, from what I understand, a Dan Aykroyd lookalike.
It was. It was. I was in high school, and a couple Navy recruiters came to. It was like career day, and the one guy looked like Dan Aykroyd. He looked just like Dan Aykroyd, and I kept staring at him, listening to what he's saying. I'm like, is that Dan Aykroyd?
Did you ask him?
Dan Aykroyd was Canadian, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So I ended up going down to the recruiting office. I talked to him there, and I'm like, "A lot of people tell you look like Dan Aykroyd." He goes, "Yes, and none of them are alive now." So it wasn't Dan Aykroyd; it was just some dude. But I ended up signing on with the reserves at that point, and then a couple years later, I joined the regular force, and then I was in that until 2009.
Were you able to put your math skills to use in the Navy?
Kind of. What I did, I was what's called a naval combat information operator. So I sat at a radar screen and I built a picture for our command staff using all the resources I had at my disposal: electronic warfare, communications, sonar, et cetera, and part of the job was determining the closest point of approach to an approaching vessel. So usually the bridge will say, "Okay, let us know if anything's going to come within 3 miles of us," and you got to know how to calculate that. And for me, it was easy. I could just visually see, yeah, it's going to be here in 10 minutes. A lot of guys had trouble, and fortunately, computers took most of the problems away.
So who was your Star Trek character equivalent?
Oh, God, I don't know, some guy below decks who you never see, who they put into a dark room and don't tell him anything.
Not a red shirt, right, though?
Not a red shirt, for sure, not a red shirt. But
everyone knows the red shirts always die.
Yeah, and when you think about shows like Star Trek and Star Wars and any of these shows, all you ever see is command staff. Like, you only see the officers. You never see any of the people that actually do the work. Like, Data sits at a console and he's like, "Yep, I got this and I got this," but somebody is down below frantically feeding information into a computer so that he can see that. And that was me.
Well, I guess things don't drastically change, because if this was like hundreds of years ago, it's the equivalent of the guy shoveling the coal into the steam engine, right? And just to keep everything moving. And while
exactly,
yeah,
and we still call those guys stokers. There's nobody shoveling coal into an engine. It's all diesels now, or turbine engines in some cases. But we still call them stokers, because back in the day, yeah, they stoked the fire. Just like my trade, they called. Communications guys, they called sparkers, because they'd have to change out crystals and they would spark when you put them in.
Learn something new every day.
So I guess the equivalent would be, in an older ship, you would be the guy at the top of the pole with the binoculars.
Pretty much.
Okay.
And
Kind of the eyes of the fleet.
The crow's nest.
Crow's nest, yeah.
The crow's nest guy.
So, Jonathan, you were giving Remi a hard time about his radio. What's your earliest recollection of, or your first piece of technology?
Oh, God. Now you're stretching it back. The first piece of technology I can remember owning was probably a Nintendo Entertainment System, like an NES. The first piece of technology I bought myself with my own money was a small boombox that would play tapes, and it would play the radio, because CDs were getting widespread, but not too widespread. And I had a big collection of tapes. Tons of tapes. And I would make these mixtapes based on radio recordings, so I could listen to my favorite music. And then from there, I didn't buy tons of technology on my own, because I was just a kid. But once I moved out, I started buying all my own stuff. Like, I remember one of the first purchases, my mom gave me a TV. She gave me her old small TV when I moved out, and I had to buy a VCR so I could actually watch some of my movies. And then that was also the year after that was when DVDs came out.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh my God, I have to have a DVD player. So I got a DVD player. And I built my own computer after that. And after that, I was building computers on my own. And now I'm, I'm still building computers. I've built my own computer that we're recording on right now.
Have you ever built any with a fish tank inside?
No, but I was very tempted to with this one because it's got a nice big window and I have a ton of space in there.
Just picturing that. That's brilliant.
No, I used to follow some of those like modders and the people who would like build their own machines. This was in the era of like, when gateways were out, and you'd see these magazines of like, obviously you'd get the best of each, the best super cooling chip, and everything had to be cool because it was like so hot. And then these crazy cases, and then you'd see some of them with like growing plants inside of them, and some of them had like aquariums. It was crazy.
Aquariums, yeah, because they'd have the lights, the
neon lights, the neon lights.
Yeah.
It was like the Fast and the Furious for computers.
That's awesome.
Another timeless classic.
Yeah. And that's not that. I don't what genre. That's just considered action genre, right?
Yeah,
yes. I would say so.
I'm really surprised that just keeps on going. How is the Fast and Furious still a thing? Can you only do so much stuff with a car?
Isn't it approaching the world of sci-fi now? Because I just saw the trailer, but there's one scene where he literally like drives the car outside the window of a skyscraper and magically lands inside like 5 floors down of the adjoining skyscraper.
Wow. What do you think, Jonathan? Is that sci-fi? Is that now a hover car?
I think it might be too fast and too furious for our show.
So, speaking of into the future, were you guys disappointed that the prognostications of Back to the Future didn't hold up too well?
No, not really. I mean, I'm a Star Trek fan, so back in 1996, we were supposed to have eugenics wars, where a race of super beings that we had bred and genetically engineered were supposed to rise up, and we were supposed to fight them. When that didn't happen, I realized that maybe a lot of the future that I see in TVs and movies is a lie, and that things aren't going to work out as we wanted to. There's things that I would have liked to have seen, though. I'm gonna tell you right now, I really don't care if the Cubs win any World Series ever, but I would have loved to, and every kid would have loved to have had a hoverboard.
Yeah. Well,
that was the one thing I wanted, and that just never really came to fruition.
Well, they've got a Lexus built one, I think, right?
Yeah, I've seen a prototype of it.
Yeah. But it's just not the same.
I imagine it'll come in due time.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I guess if you're a skateboarder kid, were you a skateboarder, Harry?
A little bit. I had one, but I didn't. I mean, just up and down the streets. I wasn't like doing flips or anything like that.
Oh, okay. So I guess you kind of have to be into skateboards, because I came from for me it was bikes or skateboards.
Okay.
And I was into bikes.
BMX.
I was into BMX. I would say to kids with skateboards, get a bike. Because that's no mode of transportation. I had a bit of a snobbish quality about being a biker over a boarder. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. As far as sports go, and the Back to the Future thing, I think the laces that do themselves up,
seemed like an afterthought.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's interesting to look at these ideas, and I think sometimes when they give us these potential futures, they go way too far out. And if we would have looked at science fiction futures in film, well, wouldn't Skynet have launched missiles by 1997?
Yeah.
So
the other thing too is I think a lot of Back to the Future, there was all kinds of technology there that was solving problems that we didn't need solving. Like, nobody's really struggling with shoelaces, are they?
That's true.
Doesn't seem like a huge problem that needs to be solved.
Who needs a hovering robot to walk your dog? If you have a dog, just walk it.
That's true.
Do we need all our food to be dehydrated and then rehydrated for consumption?
No, not at all. Dehydrated food tastes horrible.
I bet.
So what has got you guys excited in terms of, two things really. One, from a movie perspective, I'm a huge fan of trailers, actually. I watch trailers all the time, and sometimes they're the most exciting part of a movie because you watch the movie and it's really disappointing. So do you know of any movies that are coming up that are really high, present on your radar and something that you want to see?
Besides Star Wars?
Besides, yeah.
Besides Star Wars.
Besides the elephant in the room, yeah.
Jonathan?
I'm thinking.
Oh, I've got a couple.
I'm so focused on Star Wars right now. I'm not even thinking beyond that. There's a few Marvel movies coming out next year. I'm excited to see. But Rem, you go ahead and come back to me.
I'm curious to see what's going to happen with this Neil Blomkamp Alien 5 thing, and then Ridley Scott doing Prometheus 2, which is now called. It went from being called Paradise Lost, and they've just changed the name of it to, I think, Prometheus Covenant. So that's the second film in the Prometheus series. And that's supposed to give us the origins of the actual alien xenomorph. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. So how that plays out, if there are going to be two different alien films, sort of the same franchise, I'm not sure how they're going to do that, if they're going to do that. But I would be really curious to see what Neil Blomkamp would have to say about the whole alien thing, considering he did such a good job with District 9.
Ah, that's the Neil Blom. Okay, yeah. But Chappie, not so good, though, right?
Chappie, not so good. It seemed like he took a lot of his ideas and he sort of retreaded them with Elysium. Chappie, it didn't really stand up. I thought District 9 was there was a lot more going on in this particular movie, because it examined all those ideas about not only aliens but how we treat each other, and I loved that these extraterrestrials were rushed off to some sort of slum and almost become third-class citizens.
Yeah,
really good storytelling.
Yeah, that was really good. Anything come to mind, Jonathan?
Oh, tons now.
Go ahead.
I'm thinking, first of all, I'm a huge Superman fan, so that Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice, which I was super excited for it, and every time I see a little bit more for it, I just get a little bit more, what the hell are they doing kind of feeling. So I'm hoping that it's going to be better than I'm anticipating. The Deadpool movie, I'm actually super excited for. That's something I never thought they'd make. And then I thought if they make it, they're going to PG it. But nope, they're making it. It's rated R. That's going to be fabulous. I saw a trailer for this movie called Allegiant, which is part of the Divergent series. And I'll see, I've seen Divergent, and I thought it was dumb. And I never saw the sequel for it, the one before this Allegiant thing. But this Allegiant movie, at least in the trailer, looks like it's going in a different direction and makes me interested in it. So I might go see that. And of course, there's a Star Trek Beyond, which comes out in July. I'm very, very excited for that. The ones I'm more tentative on are Ghostbusters, because who's not a fan of the original Ghostbusters? Yeah. Even the second one is hilarious, and the Independence Day Resurgence. I
heard you guys chatting about that. I have no idea what it's all. A lot of the same actors too.
Yes, it's a sequel to the original Independence Day. There's a Conan movie coming, which isn't really sci-fi, but I'm still looking forward to.
How about you, Harry? What are you looking forward to?
It's hard. I mean, I don't really watch. I'm only aware of them, I think, when I see them on a trailer. And like I said, I like anything that's around time travel, and I keep an eye out for anything Christopher Nolan is doing. I was a huge fan of Inception. And
yes,
so that was really good. And and if you said there's another, I like the thought of, and I really like the sci-fi movies that have that harken back to the 2001 Space Odyssey. That sort of like show me like the space station, and show me like I was a fan of Mission to Mars, and just kind of this whole. I think maybe it's just like the whole concept of space exploration, and like it's hard to do in a way that doesn't come across cheesy. And I think one of the good things was it Prometheus that didn't really show much in terms of like whenever they hold off on showing like what the alien looks like, or they just show flashes of it, I think they leave more to the imagination. I think that's when they do a better job.
Considering how they did the first Alien with Ridley Scott, he didn't want to show the alien because it was a guy in a suit. Yeah. And he said, it's a guy in a suit. And we only really saw that at the very end. And that was one of those things as far as movie telling goes. It is so much more effective when you give just a little bit. And if you give too much away, it takes away the ability for the person to create something even more horrible.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of give me just a little bit, enough to spark my imagination, but don't give me too much, because I will probably come up with something much more terrifying than I will see on the screen.
Yeah, and it's really amazing what you can do with when you leave a lot to the imagination, and also when you have a low budget. I know you guys covered Primer, and that's actually one of my favorite unknown movies and sleeper indie movies, and I think it just speaks to how intelligently they wrote the script and the science behind that. It was a lot of it was all believable, and there was no CGI in it at all.
Yeah, and it's one of those stories you could see how somebody would be working on this technology, and they really hammered away at making this work. And I like that. I like when you get a story that comes along that's conveying an idea that's scientific and it's plausible, and it doesn't have to be big with lots of explosions and CG to be a really compelling story. And some of the films that we've done, I tend to gravitate toward the smaller films that have more of a human telling story than a big exploding science fiction, extravaganza explosion fest.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about an hour in as well. That's interesting.
Wow.
I'm really thankful for you guys for taking the time to come on and chat about all things sci-fi and not sci-fi, which I think is the beauty of the show.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for having us.
So maybe one last question. So when we think about stuff that's got you excited from a movie perspective, you guys have went through a list of a couple of items, but maybe starting with Jonathan, have you thought about the actual real future itself, and things like what Ray Kurzweil calls the singularity, and all these concepts of what it could be that's not movie related and that's our day-to-day life? Do you think about those things at all?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, one of the things that's foremost on my mind is what they're doing with the concepts of the Albuquerque drive in terms of getting a faster than light. Well, I guess not technically faster than light, just folds the space around it, but it's a practical concept that they're starting to do experiments with, which, maybe in 100 or 200 years we'll be able to actually have a ship that goes that fast practically. It's very, very exciting because it's at its infancy now, and I'm excited to see where it develops into.
They'll call it the Event Horizon.
God, no. I'll tell you what they're going to do. They will name it Enterprise.
Good thinking.
I guarantee you the first faster than light ship will be named Enterprise.
Makes sense.
What about you, Rem?
I think what we're going to be seeing, and what I'm watching now, is this merger that we're going through with technology and humanity. We're going to get to the point now and we're going to see it in our lives, where we'll be able to download our consciousness into a digital medium. Look at that film Transcendence with Johnny Depp.
Yeah,
I think at some point we're going to see that, and I'm also really curious to see how we're going to handle robots in our lives, in our daily lives. The implications of that are staggering. And as we become more and more aware of ourselves, I think we're going to learn to use technology in better and better ways. I think it's going to be a good thing. At some point, I can see how we are going to be able to transfer our physical forms into robotic structures or into networks that are able to essentially express themselves across the planet. I think we're going to see this.
Yeah,
I'm just happy with a robot that vacuums.
we have that already. That's good.
I know. I'm extremely pleased with it.
What do you think, Harry?
No, I think nanotechnologies and the fact that they're creating, this concept of using the DNA as your supercomputer. I had this just revelation recently where we keep trying to build the fastest computers in the world, and the fastest computer that's ever existed to man has always resided within our own DNA, right? So that the ability of the double helix to contain millions and millions of bits of code it's one of the things that I think I touched upon in one of the chats we had about Mission to Mars and how they showed how they repopulated Earth, and all they did was just send DNA strands of DNA down, or spores, whatever you will, panspermia. And so the fact that it can contain so much information and it's within our bodies already, it's like we already have the supercomputers inside of us. So the potential is limitless for what we can do.
So maybe instead of sending full-grown bodies, send the DNA and let the bodies grow there.
Yeah.
I like it. Nice.
Yeah. Lots to think about, and we definitely live in exciting times and stuff that didn't even exist like 5 or 10 years ago. I think the rate of change is happening exponentially, because when you look at the span between like the big technologies, maybe the printing press, and to the radio to the TV to the computer to the cloud, and the cloud to like, nano technologies, it's all happening on an exponential scale. So I think we can't even comprehend the rate of change at this point, and can't even predict it for that matter.
Now we have 3D printers, and then we're going to have replicators.
I mean, this time 100 years ago, we were barely flying.
Yeah.
Like, human flight was invented a little over 100 years ago.
It's crazy.
And within 50 years, we put a man on the moon.
Yeah, that's
and now within 100 years, we're talking about, can we get something to go faster than light?
Yeah. Exciting times indeed.
It really is. And I think it's something that we can be excited about, and we don't have to be afraid of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So where's the best place for folks to track you down and follow along with your scientific follies?
Oh, best place to go is sci-fi-moviepodcast.com. We took the little dash between sci and fi, so you can put the dash in or leave it out, and both of them go to the same place. So sci-fi-moviepodcast.com, Twitter, Facebook, all the stuff, and show notes, and 120 odd previous episodes to listen to? Yeah.
123 on Wednesday, I think.
Nice.
See, the math guy comes through again.
Hey, if you ever need some work done with a spreadsheet, Jonathan is your man.
I always have a rule that everything can be made better with an Excel spreadsheet.
I believe that. I'm a big fan myself. Yeah. Well, Jonathan, Remi, thank you so much for taking the time to come on, and I really had a blast chatting with you guys.
Harry, thank you so much. Appreciate you asking us to come and join you.
Yeah, I had a blast. Thanks a lot.
All right. So I hope that episode brought back some memories of movies that were important for you when you were growing up. And like I mentioned during our conversation, there's just some that get imprinted on you. I mentioned Jaws at the drive-in, and Star Wars, obviously, for any kid of my generation. And I think that's going to happen for Star Wars with this new one that's coming out in December. I mean, people are going crazy about it already. And I think any kid that goes to see it at a certain age, probably maybe 5 to 12 or 15 or something like that, is just he's going to have this as this constant memory. And I think we tend to forget the importance of movies as we're growing up, and the effect that they have on us. And sometimes they affect us so much that we decide we want to have a career or in movies and become a director or an actor, or follow some calling that gets pulled out of us as a result of this experience we had watching this magic on the big screen. So it was fun. It was fun to reminisce, and I have definitely a newfound respect for what these guys do in terms of breaking down the movie and the passion with which they tackle these subjects, because these topics and these movies, because they really know their shit. And let's just leave it at that. So we are a member, all of us today, of Podcastica, and it's the network we've created with the Walking Dead cast, Evil Dead cast, Under the Comic Covers, the Sci-Fi Movie Podcast, which you now know a bit more about, Once Upon a Podcast, and Game of Microphones. So highly recommend that you check one or all of those out. Shout out to Cedar and Soil, cedarsoil.com, who compose my intro outro music. And don't forget, for support, there's 3 things that I need all of you to do who are regular podcast junkies. Again, if you like the show, download and most importantly, subscribe. Remember that subscribing to the show is really your signal to iTunes that, hey, I dig it. This is awesome. And it helps in the rankings. So if you do one thing only today, subscribe to the show and then tell a friend. Let them know that this is something that they should subscribe to as well, because you don't want to miss any of the awesomeness that's coming out. And subscribing is the best way, and then telling people to subscribe is really cool too. So if you're new to the show, again, I highly recommend you check out the last 5 episodes, especially that last one with Leah Tao was pretty cool. And don't forget to support the show by rating and reviewing if you really love the show. So remember, subscribe is always the most important. Tell a friend and rate and review the show. If you haven't already, you can actually pause this right now and go do that. How awesome would that be? I'm putting in a lot of time into booking guests and the show prep. So I really want to try to bring you an insightful conversation. And as you can see, I'm covering a wide range of genres when it comes to podcasting. So I've got some interesting guests lined up. And again, they just go back and forth across the spectrum, because I think podcasting is not just, should be contained to one genre. And I'm fascinated by all of them. And I love bringing you guys along for the ride. So I think what we're going to do for the retention hashtag for today, in honor of the memories that we create that we experience when we go to a movie, we'll just call it movie night, hashtag movie night. And that'll tell me that you've made it all the way to the end. And I appreciate the folks, the hardcore fans like Patrick, like Denny, like Kim, and some others that I'm probably leaving out, who always make it a point to put the hashtag in their tweet, which is awesome. So if you want to get a shout out, then feel free to do so. I'm at podcast_junkies on Twitter. But as always, you can get everything at podcastjunkies.com. And I think that's enough for this outro. Thanks again, guys, and have a fantastic week. Stay tuned for next week's episode. It'll be a good one.